From Richard McCullough, I think FSU at some point will consider leaving the ACC unless there is a radical change in ACC revenue distribution. Drew Weatherford said, it's not a matter of if we leave the ACC, but how and when we leave. And then the last one from Justin Roth, a solution under the current ACC TV deal, very unlikely, leads us to what's next. The alternative for us staying in the conference the next 13 years is death by 1,000 cuts. Waiting is not the answer. So these are like, they're out in the open. There is no interpretation. There is no like, well, let's see what happens. Like, are they saying one thing, meaning the other? They just pounded the table and said, we want our damn money or we're leaving. And it sounds like they're already leaving. I really think, like I said earlier, Blake, them raising the concern before the ACC meetings in media day was their way of saying, you need to start coming up with something. Otherwise we're out. Their patience is gone and they're ready to hit the road.
I agree with everything that you said, but I know that my grandpappy, Joe, you know, my grandpappy was smart. My pop, we call him Pop. Pop was smart. You know what Pop used to tell me? Everything that, Blake, you say before the word but is horseshit. But I don't think it applies to this situation. I agree with everything you're saying. There's one statement in there that he said that ultimately tells me what he's trying to do. When Florida State today came out and said, we love the ACC and want to work with the ACC, told me, this is what he's trying to say to open public. Mm-hmm. We don't want to go to the SEC. We know what's going to happen if we go there. It's going to be a bloodbath. But we're going to have to get more money because, listen, Greg Sankey's calling me. Every single day, Greg Sankey's on the phone calling Florida State. I'm assuming he's calling Miami, too, to get 3 of the schools from Florida in the SEC. If they're going to bring Florida State, I would damn sure believe that they're bringing Miami. I don't think Miami has to worry about money because they're a private institution. They are very well funded. They told the ACC today, we're giving you a year. We are giving you a year. That's what I think he said. But here's the truth. If it's just Florida State, the ACC can counter. If Florida State's the team that leaves and you still have Miami, you still have Clemson, you still have North Carolina and Duke, there is a team out there that you could probably pick up, maybe not as big a brand as Florida State is, but you can add another team. I think Florida State's got to get Miami with them in this if they're going to really make it on the move. Teams do not, because, Joe, what have we seen? Mm-hmm. This is what we've always seen with conference realignment. Whether it be in 2010, remember when Texas A&M and Missouri both went to the SEC. You had multiple teams go to the Pac-12. There were the Pac-10 then. You had 2 teams enter the Pac-10. Obviously, we know what's happening with the Big Ten right now. We'll talk about that in just a minute. They're not going to just solely take one team. Now you have Arizona in the mix to go to the Big 12. So it's not just one team that's more than likely going to the Big 12. Florida State can make that statement all they want, but they're going to have to bring somebody else with them to the party to get in the SEC. That's why I believe they're telling the ACC, hey, listen, we want out, but you got to do better. That's how I read what they're saying.
So there's parts of this that I want to address that you brought up. One, I do agree that if they lose only Florida State, that doesn't actually, it impacts them because it's one of their biggest brands.
No doubt.
But they're not replaceable in terms of market size, fan base size, eyeballs that you're going to get on your brand. But the size of the conference is big enough where if Florida State leaves, they could add a Tulane, for example, that's not the sexiest name, but a growing team
You're
that has
adding
been
New
good.
Orleans.
Right. You're adding New Orleans. You're adding a competitive team that is going to put up a fight. And it actually fits with the theme of some of these other schools, which is good academic institutions. But if you start to lose multiple other teams, if Florida State needs to really put up their fists if they're going to fight here. They can't just be shouting from the other end of the bar, calling them ugly and then running out the back door because they're not really ready to go to a fight. I think that the way that they acted with Clemson when the ACC meetings came around, that Clemson might be the next to make a move like this. I wouldn't be surprised if that's not who they bring with them, or if it is Miami, as you talked about. I just think that with all of this out there on the table, it benefits them to move on. It does, because they are, and a couple other schools are carrying the weight of this conference for football, which is the biggest moneymaker. Mm-hmm. They're carrying all the weight. And their revenue share is significantly less than if they were in the Big Ten or if they were in the ACC or in the SEC. I don't know which conference they would go to exactly. The SEC makes the most sense.
They will go to the SEC. Come on. All right.
But they need to leave. I agree with everything they're saying. They're getting screwed. And you could argue,
are they getting screwed? Here's the thing. Are they? Because
they couldn't keep Jimbo. Jimbo left, and he's like one of the best coaches they've had in the history of their program.
But that's not a TV issue. That's not a TV ACC issue. If an institution doesn't want to pay their coach, that's on the institution.
They'd have more money, but they'd have more money to work with if
they weren't paying Jimbo that money to start off with. Joe, they weren't paying him $100 million guaranteed when Texas A&M started calling.
Well, if you go to the SEC, you have a lot more money to work with. Maybe you don't have as crazy of a fan base.
They weren't. Let me give you a little history lesson if you don't remember.
I do remember.
Scott Woodward was the athletic director. He was the associate athletic director at LSU when Nick Saban was the head coach. He was part of the staff that hired Nick Saban. He went to Washington, hired Chris Peterson, went to Texas A&M, hired Jimbo. He's known for $100 million guaranteed contracts. That's what he's known for. Remember, Jimbo's was $75 million. Well, when they started calling, Florida State said, and by the way, just so we're all understanding here, it was the first guaranteed coaches contract in the history of football. Football, like NFL, college.
Yes.
Of all of football, they were not going to be able to match that. And the truth was, it wasn't really on the institution of Florida State because Jimbo wanted out anyway. Jimbo didn't coach that last game.
I understand.
Not on the ACC for them and Jimbo.
I'm not saying that is 1,000,000% the ACC's fault. I'm not trying to make that connection of like, oh, he left because he doesn't like the ACC and the ACC was preventing him from getting more money. I don't see it as that. I am saying that is a good example of how they were a national championship winning team. They were one of the early teams in the college football playoff. And then Jimbo gets offered way more money to go to another conference. They probably wouldn't have matched it, but was incentivized to go to a team in the best conference in college football. And he took it and he ran with it. And since then, what have they had to show for it? They haven't been nearly as competitive, anywhere near that level of. They were dominant for a good stretch in the early 2010s. They were really freaking good. They were one of the, we talk about dynasties. We talk about how, Georgia's on this run.
They were one of the first teams to make the playoff.
They were on a pace to have a dynasty, to be that good. And they haven't been able to get back there because now the Big Ten is, getting all this money to their teams. And Michigan and Ohio State are dominant. The SEC, that deal gets all those teams that much money. They're trying to play catch up. They're 3 steps behind teams that have way more money to play with.
I fully disagree with that. 1,000% disagree with that because
why?
Because they just went out and hired really bad coaches. Joe, they paid 25.
Yeah, but they're hiring a bunch of slappies from like smaller programs.
It's not a conference's issue. Florida State being down and not getting the TV revenue has nothing to do with the ACC at all to some extent because Joe, you went out and paid $20 million to Willie Taggart in a buyout. Then you're paying an extra $20 million to fire him and get him out of there. Okay?
Yes.
So you had, hold on. So just stay with me for just a second.
Okay.
They had $40 million tied into Willie Taggart, give or take. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay? The reason you don't have money is because you poorly managed it. And the reason that Mike Norvell did not get fired, like, Joe, we know this. This isn't opinion anymore. Like, Mike Norvell has openly talked about this. The reason that they didn't fire Mike Norvell was the simple nature. And they get praised because, they gave Mike Norvell more time. No, that's not what happened. They did not have the money because they had all that money tied into Willie Taggart. That's the real reason. And here's another truth. You know why you're getting the money you're paid? Here's the reason why. Because nobody was watching your games. Because of your lack of competence and doing the Willie Taggart deal, that's what kept you down. Like, let's not act like this is all on Jimbo. Because hold on. I gave you a lengthy time here.
Okay.
Because great institutions pivot immediately and do what they have to do. Let's go through them just in this last cycle. Lincoln Riley, Brian Kelly. Oh, by the way, a couple years ago, I don't know if you ever heard of this guy, Urban Meyer, 2007. There was a guy by the name of Nick Saban, Alabama went to go get. At some point, it's on you as the institution to make right decisions. You know why Florida State's going out there saying they're broke? Because you just spent $40 million in buyout money. That's the real reason that nobody wants to talk about.
Poor hiring decisions, yes, is why they have been so unsuccessful over this recent stretch that we're talking about. But what I'm trying to get at, and I'm not saying that the ACC is the reason for all of their troubles, but they are not in an advantageous position,
Joe, they're
to
getting
succeed,
paid.
to get back where they were in the early 2010s.
And what are you doing with $35 million a year? Because I don't know if you know this, the SEC made $42 million last year. I know $11 million is a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But let's not act as if $11 million is making or breaking Florida State, because it's not. You know who else it's not making or breaking? Hold on. Guess who it's not making and breaking? Clemson.
Clemson's been fine because they've had the same head coach. They've had the same head coach.
That's the point. It comes down to you're getting paid $11 million difference. It's not like the Pac-12 when you have a $20, $30 million difference. Now, that is a problem, and I will agree with you. But all this boo-hooing, and let's call it what it is, pussyfooting around and grown-ass men with saggy-ass titties complaining about we're not getting ours, well, you made really stupid decisions. And the institutions we want to go to the SEC now. Here's the only thing that's going to happen when they go to the SEC. You ready? Mm-hmm. You're going to come here, and you're still going to fucking suck.
Wait. But that's the part where I don't agree with. And
you mean to tell me that an institution that like Florida State, who does not win national titles without Bobby Bowden, is going to come in the SEC and start kicking ass?
I'm not saying that they're going to come in and immediately win the SEC, but if of the rumored teams to go to the SEC and then the two teams that are currently joining in Texas and Oklahoma, I would argue that Florida State has the best path to success. I think that they have the stronger likelihood to be successful early on in their time in the SEC if they did make that transition. The SEC is a tough conference. I get that, but they're not going to walk in and get their ass completely waxed. I think that they're a better program than a number of programs in the SEC. They have a track record history of winning national championships. It's
with Bobby Bowden
and Jimbo Fisher. They can be a national
players with Bobby's players and culture.
And Jimbo, Bobby didn't recruit Jameis Winston.
No, but there wasn't an institution of winning at Texas A&M, and Jimbo went to A&M and got his ass kicked.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Uh-huh.
We're also talking about Florida State this year being a national championship
And I
caliber
agree with
team.
you, but they made the reason that the decision worked was because you gave the coach time, because you couldn't pay him out. I get what you're saying, Joe, and I know that you want conferences in this realignment. They're not getting hosed. Here's the truth. You want to know
they are.
How? Joe, if people aren't watching their games, okay, so I'm glad you brought this up. You know,
People are only the only people in the ACC.
so
People in the ACC are only
around the
watching
country-
4 teams. No
But-
one's watching Virginia, Virginia Tech, Boston College. No one's watching Duke games. No one's watching Georgia Tech games. People are only watching Miami, Florida
doesn't have
State,
one
Clemson.
game. Florida State did not have but one game in the top 10 of most viewed games last year.
Because they're playing nobody. They're not playing
Is
anybody.
Clemson a nobody?
That's their only good competitive game, and then
How
LSU
can
was
you
the
not
only
hit
other
the
one.
Top 10.
Wait,
If
say that
you
last
have
part.
a very strong fan, so how does LSU versus Southern get in the top 20?
Did that outperform?
Yeah.
Did that outperform
How is
Florida State?
LSU versus Southern? How are you going to convince me that an SEC team playing an HBCU gets in the top 20s and Florida State in a premier conference, a third best conference, I might add, you play Clemson and you can't get there?
What channel was LSU Southern on?
Nobody is watching the fucking game.
What channel was LSU Southern on?
SEC Plus. That's even more because it was streamed.
I need to see this list.
ESPN came out with a press release and said that, it's one of, if not our most watched streamed games of the year.
But, okay, I would also argue, though, that the SEC has the best, not only it's the best product, but they have the best media arm and media production out of any of the other conferences. I don't know the intricacies of either media operations, but I'd be willing to bet that the SEC is propping up their teams to be viewed a lot more and more effectively and more easily than Florida State. And I'm sure that's part of the reason for why they're upset, that they have a big enough of a fan base to be high up in those rankings for some of the most watched games of the year, but they're not exactly being promoted or propped up as such. I'm pretty sure that, and I might be wrong here, that Florida State Clemson game wasn't even on ABC. Like, wasn't that like an ESPN or ESPN2 game or something stupid like that?
Matter?
You have an ESPN deal. You should, that Florida State Clemson should be on ABC. I would love to, if there's a way for us to check what the TV lineup was that year.
All right.
Last year.